Hi, my name is Dylan Chong. I created this video about anti-Asian bullying, racial trauma, and mental health because I believe it's important that we bring awareness to the serious problem of bullying against AAPI youths in the United States and its detrimental mental health consequences. Did you know that 80% of Asian American students have experienced bullying in person or online in 2020? This is while 20% of students aged 12 to 18, regardless of race, experience bullying. Since the COVID-19 pandemic, there has been a dramatic surge in bullying and harassment of Asian American youths as well as of adults, consisting of verbal harassment, shunning, and physical assaults. Furthermore, 70% of Asian American youths experienced or witnessed an increase in cyberbullying in 2020. Despite being a main target of bullying, it turns out, though, that AAPI youths are much less likely to report bullying incidences than non-AAPIs. In fact, only 38% of Asian American youths told an adult about bullying, compared to 63% of non-Asian Americans. Why is this the case? According to the 2021 Asian American Bullying Report, there are several reasons. For one thing, AAPI youths often did not recognize bullying as bullying or racism as racism. They also felt shame about being bullied, and this led them to be silent about their experiences. Many AAPI youths also reported that they did not trust adults and schools to do anything about bullying. Finally, many AAPI youths also remained silent because they didn't think their parents or family members could do anything to help them. They felt helpless. All of this has led to the current situation where bullying against Asian Americans has become astonishingly normalized. Not only is there little recognition that so many AAPIs are bullied and hurt, but people think that bullying AAPI youths is acceptable. What makes this all the worse is that parents, caregivers, and educators of Asian American youths frequently lack the knowledge or tools to help Asian American youths with bullying. So, let's get our terms clear. What exactly is bullying? According to stopbullying.gov, bullying can be defined as unwanted, aggressive behavior that involves a real or perceived power imbalance. In other words, those who think that they are stronger or have more power tend to bully those perceived as weaker. Another important point here is that bullying is usually behavior that is repeated or has the potential to be repeated over time. Bullying can take the form of physical and verbal attacks, making threats, spreading rumors, cyberbullying, and everyday exclusion, such as excluding someone from a group on purpose or shunning them in some way. Exclusion is one of the most subtle but hurtful forms of bullying, and I think many of us have experienced this at one time or another.
My name is Sujin Lee. I am a licensed marriage and family therapist and executive director of Yellow Chair Collective. I work with Asian and Asian Americans in helping them to find a sense of belonging as a therapist. More specifically, I work with a lot of racial trauma and intergenerational trauma and identity finding. Bullying, simply put, to me, is aggressive behaviors or acts that is intentionally harming other people and harming another individual or group. Uh, but it can take the form of physical, emotional, social, mental, as well as cyber too. There's cyberbullying as well.
Bullying and harassment is highly traumatizing to youth, with lasting physical, mental, and emotional impacts that last well into adulthood. Countless studies have shown that bullying leads to conditions and symptoms like depression, anxiety, increased feelings of sadness, and loneliness. It also leads to changes in sleep and eating patterns, loss of interest in everyday activities, and decreased academic achievement. Experiences of bullying are also linked to substance use. Finally, experiences of bullying have been linked to suicide.
Hi, my name is Jenny Saradilla, and I am a associate marriage and family therapist at Yellow Chair Collective. A lot of youth who are experiencing bullying may be reluctant to go to school or have this fear of going to school because they might see their bully. Not only that, but they can experience a lot of shame or a lot of self-doubt, a lot of that negative self-talk. Something that I also will say too is anger. So they might experience a lot of anger because they don't know how to cope with the emotions of sadness that they're feeling, where maybe they might have been taught to keep their emotions to themselves or to save face, right? And so that can lead to anger and maybe, yeah, getting angry at their peers or teachers or even their family members.
With bullying, like I explained, because it's an intentional act of harm, it a lot of youth internalize those harms in a way that is feels shameful for them.
According to a recent study, suicide was the leading cause of death for AAPI youths between the ages 12 and 19 in the year 2022. The rise of AAPI youth suicide rates in the last few years has coincided with a growing increase in xenophobia and anti-Asian sentiments in the time of COVID-19 pandemic, which has led to a surge in anti-Asian hate incidents through 2021 and 2022. Okay, let's get a little more specific. What then is racial bullying? Racial bullying is a type of racism where someone's bullying focuses on your race, ethnicity, or culture. Racial bullying can range from deliberate physical and verbal attacks to casual but hurtful remarks.
Racial bullying is a specifically targeting those harmful behaviors towards someone, but it's based on their background. And that could be racial background or ethnic background. It can even be their cultural background. And so it utilizes stereotypes and exclusions, and sometimes, there's like mockery about their cultural identities. So it uses the person's racial identity, essentially.
What are some examples of anti-AAPI racial bullying? They can, of course, take the form of physical attacks such as pushing, shoving, punching, or hitting, or being spat on. They can be verbal attacks in the form of racist name-calling. Some common examples of this are being called ching chong or chink, being told that you are a dog eater, or being told to go back to your country. Oh, and my favorite, eat a bat and get corona. One of my classmates said this to me in school during the pandemic.
Some of the bullying that I have experienced, I have been told because I'm Filipino, right? They will say, "Oh, you probably eat dog," right? And so they have these comments or even assuming that I don't speak English, you are not one of the good Asians, like those type of comments. And I think that has impacted me because of course I would feel that feeling as if I wasn't good enough or feeling shame of my own cultural heritage in that moment.
When I was growing up, being Asian and having Asian food was not uh was not as cool as it is now. And so my personal experience has been around like making fun of by my lunch that my parents have packed me. specifically not even from other students, but from a teacher. So like a teacher would note that she had explicitly say, no one is allowed to eat in my classroom if you have kimchi. And that's kind of I'm Korean American, and it's something that is of my culture, of my race. So it was a very targeted racial bullying that was happening of somebody from authority, right? So what happens is then it becomes okay for other students, right? Because if an authority figure is making these comments, then it trickles down for other peers and students that it's acceptable to make fun of other people's foods and other people's cultural identities.
But for AAPI youths, as well as adults, much of racial bullying is experienced in the form of what we call microaggressions. Microaggressions are those subtle but hostile actions that leave us feeling unmistakably insulted, slighted, and hurt. Professor Daryl Tsu, in his book Microaggressions in Everyday Life, defines microaggressions as commonplace verbal, behavioral, or environmental slights, whether intentional or unintentional, that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative attitudes toward members of marginalized groups.
Microaggressions are more so subtle comments, and they can be intentional or unintentional. Sometimes they're often unintentional, but these comments typically reinforce stereotypes or um, reinforce or communicate these negative attitudes about these marginalized groups.
So, what's distinctive about microaggressions is that they are subtle and often hard to detect. Sometimes microaggressions don't even sound like insults, and they are frequently couched as compliments like, "Oh, you speak good English." But microaggressions are extremely stressful for people receiving them because being so subtle, they are often hard to recognize as insults and are easily denied by those committing them. So it's easy to see why people who experience microaggressions doubt themselves and don't report them. Let's look at some common examples of microaggressive bullying. Your English is really good. Where do you really come from? All Asians are good at math. They can take the form of avoidance and shunning, such as being excluded, ignored, people acting like you have a disease. The most important point about microaggressions is that because they are hard to detect and not reported, they contribute to the invisibility of Asian American bullying. In this section, I want to briefly introduce an important mental health concept called racial trauma. One of the reasons that microaggressive racial bullying is so harmful is that it contributes to what psychologists call racial trauma. What is racial trauma? According to Mental Health America, racial trauma, or also known as race-based traumatic stress, refers to the mental and emotional injury caused by encounters with ethnic discrimination, racism, and hate crimes. Racial trauma is usually not induced by one incident, but a lot of incidents that have accumulated to the point where the person becomes traumatized. Experienced over a long time, racial trauma can have very harmful health effects. Have you ever heard of the saying, death by a thousand cuts?
So, racial trauma is emotional and psychological distress that is caused by bullying, racism, discrimination, And that can look like, verbal assaults, exclusion, and also maybe even witnessing what's happening in the media. So witnessing racial trauma, and also systemic discrimination that can all play a role into racial trauma.
For example, with exposure to prolonged incidents of racism, racial trauma can lead to symptoms similar to post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD in some individuals. This can include psychological symptoms like depression, anger, self-blame, hypervigilance, anxiety, and chronic stress, as well as physical symptoms such as headaches, faster heartbeats, chest pains, and insomnia. In fact, according to the American Psychological Association, many ethnic and racial groups in the U.S. experience higher rates of post-traumatic stress disorder, and one explanation for this is the experience of racism by way of racial trauma. Studies have found that racial trauma can also be passed down the generations, and this is referred to as intergenerational trauma. Racial trauma can be experienced vicariously by witnessing others in your community undergo racism and bullying. This is referred to as vicarious trauma or secondary trauma. Another important thing to note here is that racial trauma can have detrimental health effects on entire communities. In other words, racism leads to collective, not just individual, trauma.
Um, Intergenerational trauma is when the effects of trauma are passed down from generation to generation. So one generation might experience trauma, but then that can also be passed down to their children and their children's children. So racial trauma can be experienced vicariously, especially during COVID, and seeing a lot of the anti-Asian hate crimes on the media. A lot of people can experience that vicarious trauma. And also, not only that, but even hearing about stories of discrimination that their family members have experienced, that can also cause that vicarious trauma. I believe that racial trauma can affect entire communities as well as individuals because there's this idea of collective grief where um, people in the community can share the same or can share mourning or grief together, especially when they see someone in their community who has been impacted or who has been harmed from AAPI violence. And so they all can experience it. But not only that, they when an AAPI individual experiences racial trauma or discrimination or violence, it impacts the whole community where it then cultivates this fear and hypervigilance when people go out into public spaces.
Well, what can we do about anti-Asian bullying? Here are some of the things we can try. Provide more mental health and consultation services for Asian American children who have been bullied or may need help. Support safe spaces and student groups for Asian American youth to talk about their identities and to foster positive self-esteem, including in schools. Develop easily shareable and accessible anti-bullying resources and toolkits for Asian American children, teens, caregivers, parents, and educators. In general, it's clear that education and raising awareness is key. So, we might start by educating the public about the prevalence, severity, and impact of anti-Asian bullying, gather data on Asian American youth and bullying, train educators and school administrators on how to identify and respond to identity-based and racially based bullying, and mitigate bullying behaviors. Finally, advocate for secondary school curricula that are culturally inclusive and reflect the full diversity of our nation. Advocating for inclusion of AAPI history is particularly important.
My number one thing around making a difference in our society and our culture is education. Making sure that not just the Asian American community members and youth, but everyone understands that racism exists in America and that Asian Americans and AAPI community are impacted by the racism. And then I want to make sure that schools themselves have policies in place to make sure that the students feel safe to talk about what is happening. Because very oftentimes when I speak with students, they feel like they can't trust the authority figures at their schools to be able to safely bring up what they need to be bring up, right? To take charge and to speak out. So I talked about my biggest thing, and the number one thing is around education. This means that representation of the AAPI history, AAPI stories told in the lens of AAPI individuals are very, very important to be incorporated into the educational system.
Having more mental health resources for AAPI youth if they are experiencing bullying so that they know where to go to if they are experiencing maybe depression or suicidal thoughts because of bullying. In addition to that, I think having more community-based interventions, so that could look like having more workshops to discuss maybe racial inclusion and also having more like support groups in the communities.
I hope that this video has played a small part in helping to increase awareness of anti-Asian bullying. And moving forward, I hope that we can work together to improve the lives of Asian American youths. Thank you for listening.